Hello and welcome to Tuesdays with Morrissey, where we share insights from great thinkers. I'm Adam Morrissey. Today I'm excited to be joined by Phil Barden. Phil is one of the world's leading authorities when it comes to decision sciences and the author of the book Decoded, The Science Behind Why We Buy. If you haven't read Decoded, it's a masterclass in understanding what drives our daily purchasing decisions. Before leading his own firm, Decode, Phil held leadership roles at T-Mobile and Unilever at key points in those companies' histories. Phil, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Adam. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, awesome. We've had some really great guests recently in marketing, branding, and storytelling, including some folks from Byron Sharp's team at Ehrenberg Bass, some former Ferrero folks. So excited to have a conversation about why companies buy. You define decision sciences as the conclusions from collective learnings from neuroscience, behavioral economics, and psychology. How did you first come across decision sciences and what hooked you about the concept?
I first came across this whole field when I was a client. I was VP for the T-Mobile brand in Europe and charged with relaunching and repositioning the brand around Europe. And I had commissioned a huge piece of market research at great expense and invested a lot of personal equity in it. And we got some preliminary results back, and frankly, they weren't making any sense. And I got really worried because I thought there's a lot at stake here, company money and my own reputation. My job was at risk. And somebody kindly introduced me to a couple of guys from Decode. And one is a neuroscientist and the other is a cognitive psychologist. And I got them in and started talking to them and showing them some adverts, for example, that I'd tested and said, why do you think we got these results? Or why did this ad fail in research but work well in the market, or vice versa? And the way they responded to me was using language and frameworks and terminology that I'd never heard before. But when they explained where they were coming from and why they were saying the sorts of things they were saying, it made perfect sense. And it was almost as if a veil was lifted from my eyes. There was suddenly lots of aha moments when I realized that they could unlock a lot of hitherto unanswered questions. So that was the first time I came across this idea that science and academia hold the key to a lot of human understanding. And it's not surprising, really, because they've been studying it for 150 years or so. But these two guys combined their fields of expertise, and that was very synergistic. And that's one of the benefits of looking at a whole range of sciences. So you're not focused solely on neuroscience or on cognitive psychology or on social psychology or on behavioral economics. If you combine them all, which is what we do as an approach, you get a real holistic understanding of human behavior. And I think the big realization for me talking to these guys was that the essence of marketing, indeed the essence of any commercial business, is behavior change, right? We want people to buy our brand, our product, our service. We want people to share stuff online, to talk about it, to advocate, whatever that is. It's human behavior. And the combination of these scientific and academic approaches could be leveraged to unlock a lot of effectiveness and efficiency in marketing.
You mentioned making a big bet. I don't think people really give that enough credit to the personal risk that chief marketing officers and marketing executives make in certain campaigns and such. What was the bet you were making?
Well, initially the bet was on this other piece of research that it would yield insights, and it didn't. And so we quickly got out of that and transferred it to Decode's approach. So that was also a big bet because it was untried and untested in my experience, and certainly within the company. But the results were compelling and intuitive. And the next big bet was to translate those findings into a brand proposition and then an advertising platform. And the big bet that arose from that was an advertising idea about creating memorable moments to share. And the first manifestation of that was an ad unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was probably the first flash mob ad, and it took place in one of London's busiest railway termini, Liverpool Street. And so you ended up with like 400 people dancing in sequence on the concourse, and lots of people looking at them and taking pictures and calling their friends and sharing stuff. And the ad itself was a big bet because it didn't feature any proposition like, a mobile phone tariff. It didn't feature any product, any handsets. It didn't feature any promotional message or a message about network coverage or call quality, which was very unusual in those days in the telco market. So it was purely about this creation of memorable moments to share, and that's what motivated not only the people within the ad to share stuff, but ultimately people in public who watched the ad. So that was a big bet at the time as well, and we were frankly very nervous to see what the impact was, but we needn't have been, and the impact took us all by surprise. So within 48 hours of that ad going out, it was a TV ad. This is back in 2009. Within 48 hours, footfall into T-Mobile stores in the UK doubled. And the sales department were criticizing marketing for not telling them about local store activation activity that they'd booked and scheduled. And marketing's response was, well, we didn't book any. There was none, right? Well, why are you asking? And it was because the traffic, the monitors on the store doors, which monitor footfall, were showing twice the amount of footfall. And that one ad went on to be the most successful in British telco history. It grew sales by 49%. It grew share by 6%. It tripled brand consideration. And it's got 41 million YouTube views, which is still pretty good going. We didn't have Instagram at the time, and it was very early days of Twitter, but Facebook was pretty big as a platform then, and it spawned something like 72 Facebook groups. And up and down the country, people were filming their own flash mobs. It became part of culture. It was really quite amazing. So there's a whole series of big bets: the research, switching vendor, a different research approach, a completely different advertising approach, but they paid off.
Yeah. How did you even come up with the flash mob concept?
Well,
had you seen it anywhere else?
No, that was the genius of the advertising agency, Saatchi. So we just gave them the brief. The brief was based on the motivators of human behavior, and it was their creative genius that came up with the flash mob as a way of this creating memorable moments to share, and the idea of a sort of contagious spreading sharing going on. And then they repeated that with similar ideas around Europe. So in Germany, for example, in one city, we had cannons that fired loads of rose petals, which rained down in the city. So everyone was like looking up and photographing and filming and sharing and calling, etc. So that was another idea of sort of flash mob, but with flowers.
Yeah, awesome. A big theme of your work is Daniel Kahneman's findings in thinking fast and slow, particularly the autopilot type thinking, which is a lot of what our brain does. Why is it so important to you to understand, the different ways people think, and how do the best companies work in that element to make sure it's easy to process the information that are coming through autopilot?
It's absolutely fundamental to understand it. So for people who haven't come across this idea of different sets of mental processes in the brain, which Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2. System 1 acts like an autopilot. It does very complex stuff automatically. You're not even conscious of it working, and it runs 24/7. And it is really how Mother Nature has evolved the human species to be able to act and react to stimuli. Because if we had to process stimuli in a reflective, slow fashion, we'd be dead. All right. The thing thundering towards us, is it a mate? Is it pleasant? Or is it trying to attack us and kill us and eat us ultimately? So nature's devised this really fast, intuitive, spontaneous, implicit way of acting. And conversely, the pilot system, which is effortful and slow, is what we think of as thinking. It's conscious thought, but it's very effortful and it has limited processing bandwidth. And one of the big learnings for me was thinking back on my marketing career about the types of research that we had conducted, the sorts of questions that we asked people, all get people into this reflective thinking mode. One of the problems with that is human beings are poor witnesses to their past behavior and poor predictors of their future behavior. But we're very good at rationalizing stuff. And that's what this pilot system or system 2 does. We make stuff up. So I can remember listening to the outcome of focus groups, which are an artificial context, right? Nobody discusses an advert or a piece of packaging or a service proposition for a couple of hours. No, that's just not the real world. And people say things under those conditions that they will never do. And one of the things that the Kahneman approach taught me was what's been termed the say-do gap. So what people say and what they do can be very, very different things. So we need to acknowledge that. We need to understand that so much of what we do is habitual, it's driven by context, it's automatic, and it's reflex, and it happens without conscious thought. And we need to understand the conditions under which that set of mental processes will dominate any decision making. And they're easy to understand. They're, for example, when we're under time pressure, when there is choice overload. You might think when you're going to buy insurance on the internet, right? The advantage, we have perfect information. We have access to all of this stuff. But what do we go with? Normally the brand we know or the cheapest, because the choice is overwhelming and we just simply cannot process any of that stuff. So when there's complexity of choice, when we're not particularly involved in a purchase, it's not, it's only costing you a few dollars, so it's not a matter of life or death, or we may not be that really interested in the category. We might be, or we might not be. If it's habitual, something you buy every week, it doesn't merit a lot of reflective thought. And also, if we're distracted, the number of times you're talking to someone and there's your phone pings and you look at your phone, you lose track of what that other person is saying because we cannot stack all of these tasks at the same time. So those are real world issues, right? Complexity, low involvement, overload, and time pressure. And only one of those conditions needs to be present for our actions and our decisions to be dominated by this autopilot system.
Yeah, I remember a couple of weeks ago, I had Dr. Ella Ward from Ehrenberg Bass on. I was really excited to have this conversation about how people think about brands and connect with brands. And she said exactly what you're saying. The reality is people don't think about these brands that much because if they did, they wouldn't have much time or capacity for anything else. And it's amazing to see what groups like Aldi comes to mind. They've been able to do something really effective by keeping it really simple.
Yeah.
When you're sharing some of this stuff, and what I thought was so interesting about your book, you said the one thing you wish you would have understood sooner is the role of implicit and explicit goals.
Yeah.
And like at the end of the day, what people are trying to do in purchasing decision is meet their goals. How do you navigate? Like, all right, like I want to help this person meet their goals, but there's also these biases where people say one thing and do the others. How do you manage around the irrationality of people when trying to signal certain things?
Well, the best approach, and this is what we do globally, is quantitative testing using a so-called implicit methodology. So implicit testing grew up in social psychology several decades ago because the psychologists knew that there was this big difference, the say-do gap. So they devised a methodology that enabled the person to respond basically on autopilot and prevented the pilot system or system 2 from overriding or intervening and controlling the answer. And that's really the hallmark of implicit testing. You don't want people to reflect on the answer. You want that automatic gut, spontaneous, intuitive response. So a lot of these, there are many different implicit paradigms, but a lot of them rely on reaction time. So you are getting a response from people in a study in less than a second. And the brain works obviously that quickly, but it's far too fast for system 2 or the pilot to engage and moderate the answer. Because another bias that comes in, as you alluded to biases, is self-reporting. How do I want to portray myself? Trying to second guess what the research is about. An obvious sort of censorship, if you're asked about gender or racial stereotypes, or do you beat your partner? Well, what's the answer going to be, right? There's a lot of social acceptability in there. But if you use an implicit technique, you get around that that gatekeeper in the brain, if you like, and you get that pure instinctive intuitive response. So that's a great way to get to this system 1 automatic association that exists in the brain between the goals that drive a category, the goals that are associated with brands and the client brand versus competitor brands, or the goals that are evoked by a bit of creative stimulus or a sponsorship idea or a piece of packaging design, or whatever it might be, whatever the touch point is, you can use this type of research to get to the system 1 response.
One of my favorite concepts from the book were tangibility, immediacy, and certainty. Could you speak a little bit to those concepts?
Yes. Again, this goes back to our system 1 and how it's biased towards action and what it will respond to in preference to something else. And the principles of TIC we often apply to things like promotions. So tangibility talks to the concept of us preferring something that is tangible rather than intangible. An example I always give with a promotion is if you're going to a retail store and there's a promotion to win a mountain bike, put a mountain bike in the store, right? It's there. I can see it. I can touch it. It is absolutely tangible and real, compared to mentioning it on a coupon or showing it on a digital ad or whatever. It's much less tangible than the physical thing, and the brain responds to that tangibility. Immediacy talks to the bias to want it now. The brain prefers gratification instantly rather than something that is some way off in the future. So again, from a promotional point of view, having a QR code that gives you an immediate response, or a sort of scratch and win idea with an immediate response, is much more of an incentive for the brain to engage with, rather than this is a prize draw and the draw takes place in 3 months' time. And then certainty is based on the old saying, a bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. It's linked with tangibility. I'd rather be certain of getting a reward than potentially a better reward, but it's less certain. So again, using a promotion analogy again, having prizes, whether it's monetary or some other item, that has a high chance and probability of winning, versus maybe many more items or a bigger ticket item, but with a much lower chance of winning. And the one that's more certain will be preferred by the brain.
Is this why consumers are willing to pay $7 for a coffee at a Starbucks, but think it's unreasonable to pay $15 for a bag of beans at a grocery store?
Kind of. It's linked, but I think there's something else going on here, which is the role of and importance of context. So when I started working with the guys from Decode, and I was talking about behavior being all about the individual, they said, well, of course, the individual is important, but there's an equation, basic equation in psychology, which says behavior is the product of the person and the situation. And if you think about your own experience of choosing, let's say, an alcoholic beverage, assuming you enjoy the occasional alcoholic beverage, Adam, if you think about where you are, indoors or outdoors, at work, at home, some other venue, who you are with, work colleagues, partner, friend, clients, the time of day. Is it lunchtime? Is it too early to have that beverage? Is it evening? The temperature, is it warm and sunny? Is it cold? Am I on vacation or not? All of those are contextual. And if any one of those changes, that can dramatically influence your choice of beverage. You stay the same. You're still the same constant. You are the individual. But if you change the context, it changes your choice. And that can also change our willingness to pay for things. So coming back to Starbucks, because I'm in a Starbucks and that context has a whole other set of experiences and associations with it. The third place between home and work, the baristas, the world music, the decor, etc. That can influence our willingness to pay. It's the same, why would we pay $50 for a bottle of wine in a restaurant, but if we go shopping for ourselves to take something home, if the same bottle of wine for $10, you might think, well, that's a bit expensive. I'm not going to pay that, right? But I'm very happy to pay $50 in a restaurant. Bizarre, but we just change the context, and that changes our willingness to pay.
You mentioned when you dove into this topic, there were a lot of things that you were doing wrong with the topic of decision sciences, that is, like as a marketer. How would you capture what the status quo looks like versus what marketing looks like when you're using decision sciences and psychology to the fullest?
Well, some of the things I've already talked about. So understanding research techniques and really deciding that the correct research technique depends on the construct that you wish to measure. So if you want to get people's opinions of an advertisement and you show them the ad, it's perfectly reasonable to ask some System 2 pilot type questions because the construct requires reflection. So that's the valid technique to use for that construct. If, however, you want to measure emotion or implicit associations, then you need a System 1 type construct and methodology. So that's a big difference now. I think that the world of marketing and market research and insight, as I see it, and as I see it evolving in clients, has changed. I wouldn't say that behavioral science and the research techniques allied to it are mainstream yet. There's still a long way to go because people have got legacy data, right? They've got time series reports, and it's comforting to stick with the status quo. That's another human bias. We default to what we know and what's familiar because change is inherently risky. So that's one of the big differences, I think. The other is just this understanding that human beings are prone to many different biases. We are not the rational Homo economicus that traditional economics would have us believe, where even in a world of seemingly perfect information, we can make considered rational choices. We just don't do that. I had a lovely example with a chief finance officer of an automobile manufacturer, and I did a workshop for them and introduced this concept of System 1 and System 2. And he said to me, I completely disagree with you. In our category, car purchasing is rational. It's System 2. And he said, I'll give you a personal example. I constructed a spreadsheet when I got my last company car because I had a fixed budget on one hand. On the other hand, I had the different models and the trim and the specification, the fuel efficiency, the CO2 emissions, the depreciation, and putting that all together enabled me to make a very rational choice. Therefore, car purchase is rational. And I said to him, I completely agree that the process you went through was very rational and very much a System 2 process. But why did you do that in the first place? Why did you create the spreadsheet? And he said, so that I could have a BMW outside my house. So, okay, that's interesting. So actually, your brand choice had already been made, right? Your System 1 had learned associations over many, many years that a BMW signals something. And what it signaled about him, though he wasn't ready to admit it or able to admit it was about status and how he would appear to his neighbors from the fact that he drove a BMW. So everything else that he then did with the spreadsheet was a way of rationalizing his purchase decision. So I think just people understanding that sort of distinction is important as well.
Yeah, there was a really good book by a guy named Luke Burgess called Wanting, which was based off a French philosopher that was basically boiled down to saying we want what other people want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the social psychology is fascinating because so much of what we do is regulated and geared towards our own evolution and being influenced. You've probably heard of things like the herd instinct or the herd effect, and the idea of social proofing and social norming, that we conform to or make decisions based on what others do. It's a very powerful effect.
There's a horrific tale in a book called Ordinary Men, which is about like the most gruesome German prison brigade in World War II. And what was so interesting about it, it was like older guys in their late 30s, so like they didn't grow up with as much of the propaganda and the brainwashing as the other folks. It just strictly came down to like peer pressure and culture and the willingness to be accepted in their group. You wrote the first edition of Decode back in 2013.
Yeah.
And you published a second edition about 10 years later. What did you see over that 10-year period?
So there've been many more studies conducted in the whole field of behavioral sciences and decision science. So I wanted to capture some of those. I wanted to check that the studies that I'd cited in 2013 were still valid as well. And there's new information I wanted to bring in. So after I published in 2013, I was working with Carlberg, the beer company, at their headquarters in Denmark. And their insight manager was fascinated by some of the studies and took them to her business and said, we should do this stuff. A lot of it was around pricing and how price is displayed. And she met with a lot of resistance in the company who said, these are just academic studies. Yeah, they've got no relation to the real world. So she set out to test them herself. And she set up a lot of testing protocols with a third-party agency just to try them. And she found that they all worked. They all had similar effects to those cited in the book. And she very kindly shared the results with me and gave permission for the results to be published. So those are in the second edition. So we've got not just, here's the original academic study and what it suggested, but here's what actually happened in reality. So that was a very interesting update. The other update was bringing out more about this concept of jobs to be done. So the late Professor Clayton Christensen from Harvard was the real sort of father of this concept, and it dovetails beautifully with goals, because the whole idea is that we hire a product or a service to enable us to do a job, and that job is both functional as well as social, emotional, and psychological. So, a lot of people stop at the idea of, I think Theodore Levitt said, people don't buy a 1/4-inch drill. What they want is a 1/4-inch hole. So, well, yeah, but that in itself is a means to an end. So why do I need to drill a hole in the wall? Because I'm going to put up some shelves, or I'm going to hang a piece of art, or I'm going to put a TV on the wall, or whatever. So those are the jobs to be done, linked with things like entertainment, belonging, warmth and closeness with your family, or displaying a whole library of books which might say something else, or displaying a piece of art which says something else and meets different goals or jobs to be done. So that was another concept that I wanted to expand.
Were you involved at all in that Carlsberg campaign where they say probably the number one beer in the world?
That predates me, actually, but it is interesting because another aspect that I introduced in the latest edition of Decoded, which wasn't in the first one, is this whole idea of distinctive brand assets, which Ehrenberg Bass obviously talk a lot about as well.
Yep.
And I was invited to give a keynote speech at Carlsberg's annual conference in 2016, which was held in Paris. when the Euro soccer championships were on, and I went along to one of the games with my host, and I was amazed to see around the stadium this continuous running of probably, the word probably repeated in with the typeface and white out of a green background. And I said to my host, I don't know how many millions of euros you are spending sponsoring this event. Why have you not got your brand name? And he said, well, because it's illegal in France. We cannot promote an alcoholic brand by name. And so what they did was use the word probably, using their font and using the green and white colorways. And that's because that's one of their distinctive assets. So it was a beautiful example of how to use distinctive brand asset, which is a learned recognition without the brand name having to be present. So they could get around the law and do it quite legally and sponsor a major event.
That's fascinating. I mean, I knew what Carlsberg was at like 7 years old because they were the sponsor of the Liverpool kids,
right?
And everyone was playing soccer. I really like what you're saying about, and Clayton Christensen, obviously, about the jobs to be done and really focusing on end results or values. There's a pretty famous quote from a French philosopher that's, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, or if you want to show somebody, like, imagine showing somebody the first television. You wouldn't show them a cable box.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You'd show.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's, that links to their ultimate motivations. In the case of the seafarers, it's exploration and discovery and curiosity and novelty, which is a very powerful system in the brain.
When you wrote the first edition of Decoded, social media was relatively pretty new. How do you see, or what do you think is most interesting about how social media has changed things for marketers?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious thing is the audiences and how their consumption of media has changed dramatically, especially for those cohorts who grew up with linear appointment to view television, and of course that's changed in itself as well now with on demand and streaming, but also the massive growth of cellular mobile phone penetration, and right at an early age as well. So people are getting used to. I mean, when I had one of my kids, when he was 2, was going up to the TV and swiping the screen. This just quite incredible how sort of new habits are formed. So and to the exclusion of other media as well. So the fact that there are certain audiences who probably only consume media through their devices, and dual devices as well. So they might be looking at something on a tablet, but also have their phone, or maybe a bit of something on TV, but also have their phone as well. So I think that the nature of viewing and media consumption is obviously a big change. That doesn't mean, and I make this point in the revised edition of Decoded, that doesn't mean the reason why people are consuming them has changed. Mm-hmm. It's simply the means that they have. It's another channel. They're still using social media for discovery, for entertainment, for communing and sharing and belonging to groups, for status, etc. So for excitement and novelty seeking. So the fundamentals of human behavior haven't changed. They won't change either. I love this expression from Bill Bernbach, who says, we obsess about everything that changes. Actually, we should obsess about unchanging man, because what drives Gen Z, drove young people a decade ago, 2 decades ago, etc., and their grandparents. We're still driven by the same motivations and goals. The way we achieve them is what's changed. So I think that's the key thing that I've seen.
Yeah, everything changes, but the nature of man.
Yes.
Was it hard for you to transition from like a marketing career to a career in this emerging field, which is much more like a science?
Yes, for two reasons. One, having only ever been a client and then switching to being a vendor, that was a big mindset change. But the second thing, and I guess I should have anticipated this, is the difficulty of behavior change per se. So when I had the experience of T-Mobile, it was so compelling because I'd witnessed it. It was so compelling that I thought that almost by thought transference or osmosis or just my evangelism about it, that other people would share that experience, and of course they don't, and they can't, because they simply haven't had that experience. So when I set Decode up in the UK, I got appointments to see a lot of my former colleagues, especially at Unilever, where I'd spent most of my career, and they were all very happy to see me and listen to what I had to say. And I did a presentation about System 1 and System 2 and about the T-Mobile story, etc. And honestly, they were like rabbits caught in headlights. And at the end of it, they sort of nod and say, wow, this is amazing. Yeah. Anyway, it's a bit too difficult right now. Give us a call in a month or so. And I was quite shocked and surprised and scratching my head. Why are they not embracing this in the way that I have? And it was simply because they hadn't experienced it. And in one case, a guy actually contacted me about 18 months later and said, you know, that stuff you were talking about, could you pop back in and can we have a chat about it? And what had happened during those 18 months in between time was that he had heard more about this kind of stuff just on LinkedIn or through other agencies, and it started to become a little bit more talked about, so accepted. By that stage, of course, I had many more useful case studies, because that's the other way that people start to embrace this, is if XYZ has done it before and it worked. It's a bit like, coming back to the herd effect and the social proof. If they've done it and I respect them as a brand or as a company, then it must be okay. So it's not as risky as if I was a pioneer.
What's one piece of advice you'd give from lessons from Decoded for people, regardless of what they do for work or in their life?
My one piece of advice would be to understand the concept of goals and how they motivate human behavior. There was a guy at Stanford who said that they are the system units of human functioning, and goals regulate everything we do, whether we're aware of it or not. So even in our lives, outside of purchase decisions, we are driven to achieve goals, whether that's as basic as I'm thirsty, so I need a drink to rehydrate, or as emotional and psychological as I'm going to buy that particular brand because, and we don't say this, by the way, but we know, this is what it's for, a premium, super premium brand, because I know it acts as a badge and says something about me in terms of superiority and self-esteem and power. And just understanding that will help people, I think, understand their own motivations, their peers, their family, their boss, as well as then applying it to commercial work.
Yeah, I think that's a conversation in of itself that might be worth having, is the architecture of some of those structures, brand structures and power structures. I always think it's so amazing. Like, you make a certification program and it changes everything.
Yep.
And it's just this made up thing with a sticker and a stamp, and it says you're certified. And it's like there's a certain confidence that comes with that additional layer of structure.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's a signal, it's a signal to us, it's a signal to others that we've achieved something.
Well, Phil, you've been really generous with your time. Before I let you go, what's the best way for people to keep up with you, the work you do at Decode, and this space?
Well, they could connect on LinkedIn. So I'm quite active there. Or if they want to connect directly with me, I'd be very happy for people to send me an email. The address is phil@decodemarketing. That's all one word, all lowercase, .com. and welcome any conversations, particularly if people have read the book and have got questions or thoughts or feedback. That's always great to hear.
Awesome. We'll have links to both those in the show notes, but thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks, Adam. Been fun.
Thank you for listening to Tuesdays in Morrissey. That conversation was with Phil Barden. Phil is one of the world's leading authorities when it comes to decision sciences and marketing, and the author of the book Decoded, the science behind why people buy. What I loved about the episode is what we can learn about how brands influence behavior and the importance of goals and how we can use those to increase our influence in the world. If you enjoyed the show, share it with a friend, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks.